So we are live. So now we will just wait for all our lovely friends to come and join, have a listen, maybe ask us some questions. So it's very exciting because the tension always builds as you're waiting, or as I'm waiting to kind of see the numbers, who's in, who's joining. So this is the tense part, waiting for someone to say hi.
Great.
I know you were very clever. You already came with tea or coffee, and I forgot to do that bit.
Yes, I had time in between meetings, so quite lucky.
Yeah, I did a cappuccino first thing in the morning, and then I had another coffee. So today I'm running on coffee and fumes.
Yeah, this is my third cup as well.
Yeah, like I was like, okay, I haven't eaten yet, so I will delay, and I will have another cup probably after, like this afternoon, after 2 meetings, and I have another cup. But yeah, same. So we usually just wait a couple of minutes for people to join, and then even if nobody joins for now, we can still get going, and everyone can kind of catch up on us later. Great. How are you anyway? So we can always ask that. How are you doing?
Good. I got up quite early this morning. I'm usually not an early bird, so quite proud. And have been in calls all day so far, and it's going to continue until 9 o'clock. So this is a kind of a Zoom day for me. How about you?
I tried to get up early this morning, but it didn't happen. So my alarm went off at 6. It didn't happen. My alarm went off at 7:30. It didn't happen. So I got up today at maybe 8 o'clock.
That's still early.
That's early for you, though.
Yeah, for me it's early. I mean, today I'm proud to say I got up at 6 something. But I snooze like from 5 o'clock, like.
Yeah, like the 7-minute snooze, and then those 7 minutes just feel so delicious, and then you're like, okay, it's time to wake up again. What? You know what? Let's just crack on anyway. And people will say hello as and when. So, thank you, of course. Thank you so much for joining me for us to have this discussion, because it's just so nice to meet other women who are also putting a focus on women and making sure that we are not only visible, not only heard, but also empowered. So if you don't mind giving yourself a little bit of an introduction, tell us a little bit about you, at what point you even decided to kind of commit your career to really focusing on women, and what's your motivation and how you kind of see the future. We'll go through all of that, but let's start with that. Like, tell us about Jessica Espinoza. Where do we start?
Okay, let me perhaps start with a brief introduction, more focusing on where I am now, and then we can kind of go back to how I got.
Okay, let's do that.
So I currently work as a senior investment manager at DG. That's the German Development Finance Institution, DFI, and DG invests in emerging markets in the private sector. So private sector companies, project finance, really the entire private sector in Latin America, Africa, and Asia. And I can tell a bit more, talk a bit more about my role as an investment manager, but basically I'm directly doing the investment deals, to put simply. And I'm also the chair of the 2X Challenge. That's a global initiative, investor-led, that was launched at the G7 Summit in 2018. With the ambition to mainstream agenda lens across private sector investment practices. So the 2X Challenge in 2018, when we went together on stage, we gave ourselves the challenge to collectively mobilize at least $3 billion with agenda lens until the end of 2020. And so, I mean, going out there, making the commitment was one thing, but then really delivering on it was a whole different story. But I'm happy to say that we've already surpassed our target, are now about to announce the next target. So that's another role that I currently have and that I'm particularly excited about. And then also kind of related to my DG role, I also serve on the board of MEGA, a Mexican financial institution, where I'm also supporting in different kinds of capacities, but I'm particularly excited about this gender lens strategy that the company is currently implementing. So really looking at the core business and at gender smart opportunities there. And I'm also a mentor for Endeavor and some of the other global entrepreneurship networks, where I'm also mentoring entrepreneurs on their journey. So that, in a nutshell, is kind of my current job.
But you've forgotten one of the most important details.
Oh, that's right. I just launched a social venture, XOCO. So that's kind of what is keeping me up at night. and it's definitely one of these initiatives that I'm especially enthusiastic about at the moment, and love to tell you more about that as well.
No, that's amazing, because obviously you've been in this business of working with a gender lens for a long time. And, we both know that it's not always easy having, in my case, focusing on Black women, it's not always easy having these conversations as to how to kind of put women at the forefront, in your case, in my case, putting Black women at the forefront without there being pushback. How have you managed to kind of negotiate that position? Because you're obviously working in the private sector. The private sector isn't held to the same level as accountability as the public sector. They can just do what they want. Pre-2020, I'd say the public at large is now holding everybody accountable to how they do business, how they invest, what does their board look like, what's their company construction. But prior to that, this probably wasn't as high up on the agenda as a topic to discuss or even to push. So how have you been able to kind of negotiate that part of, putting women first in business?
So it's a very interesting question, and I'm going to start kind of from the practical angle and how we've managed to do it. But there's actually also a very interesting, more philosophical debate going on in academia. So that's also, it's kind of interesting to see the context and also what has not worked in previous decades and why is it working now. But just very practically speaking, in the investing world and kind of the world of development finance institutions and private sector investment or investors, we've really noticed that to get companies excited about this and really to get them on board to look at their core business and really change the way we do investments in the mainstream, not just in a niche of kind of impact investing, but really more broadly. And also to really look at the core business and to implement practices across kind of the value chain of a company, is really to make the business case. So once companies understand the business case, it's a really strong lever, and that kind of is what we've seen in practice is what accelerates change. So I would say first understand the business case, but then also understand how exactly it's relevant for the private sector and for the specific companies, what they can actually do to promote gender equality and women's empowerment, and also more broadly like social and intersectional justice. I think for a lot of company representatives, it's also the rights-based approach that resonates. So I think everybody kind of understands it. And also if we think not only about gender, but social justice and other impact topics more broadly, even the kind of the stereotypical old white men, they all have kind of kids who are part of the Fridays for Future movement. And so I think everybody also understands the moral imperative, the human rights aspect of it and all of that. But it's often for them, I think it's also not always easy to talk, to use kind of a more feminist language or a rights-based approach and to talk about it in the boardroom among other men and all of that. So I've also found that the business case resonates with so many because it's also an easy and legitimate way to bring the topic onto the agenda and to talk about it and to show why this makes sense for everybody, right? It makes sense for all the stakeholders, but also for shareholders, for purely profit-driven individuals. There's always an argument for it. So it's a win-win-win.
No, absolutely. It is a win-win-win. And I think sometimes the problem is that if leadership is too far removed from it. So, let's just say, not to stereotype before anybody jumps on us, but let's just say that, a lot of these power men have women who have wives, who typically stay at home. It may be very difficult for them to be able to really envisage why it's so important for women to be in leadership. We had that, is it in Handelsblatt, the 85-year-old recruiter who basically was like, women working, and he'd placed however many candidates over a long career. And sometimes that can be the problem. It can feel so distant. They feel as though it's too far away. Why do we need to do this? But as you said, the point is that a lot of people in leadership understand facts and figures in black and white. And that's why it has to be, to your point, it has to be a business case, because otherwise it's not going to speak to them on any other level besides, what does it do essentially for my bottom line?
Right. And we also don't want like women or other underrepresented groups to be kind of the new charity project. We want this, right. We want like real justice and representation, and to be taken seriously, and really to change, like to promote more systemic change. So I think that's why it also makes a lot of sense to kind of focus on the business case.
No, absolutely, because it's also not about saying that the standards are being lowered to allow Black women into the room. You don't need to lower the standards. It just has to be, you have to be open in the first place. And as you said, going back to the systemic part, you have to put processes and procedures in place that don't assume that everybody starts from the same place. That, and also going outside of your circle, you see it time and time again, that what percentage of jobs what percentage of people do get jobs via referral and not via, the usual application process, but rather, hey, this is the son of, or this is the brother of. And if you're not in the circle, a lot of the time you don't get to play to win.
Exactly. And that's what we see, everywhere, like in recruitment and also in investment decisions at the end of the day. So like these inner circles, I think that's really a crucial point.
Right. So how does it feel to be a woman in these inner circles? Because you're actually doing the investment deals, which is, you are a mover and shaker, but actually a power holder in that sense, to kind of make sure that other women are then being empowered and passing it forward. How is it for you existing in that space?
It's a very complex question. So
no.
to answer it, it feels good, but sometimes even in positions of power, you still feel sometimes powerless, because it's not all up to you, and you still have to convince your investment committee, all the members, and everybody who kind of has a veto in it, and a vote. What is perhaps interesting, going like one step back in my journey, so when I started my career, I always thought, getting to a position of decision-making power, and especially in running a company, that's where you can really promote change. And then very early in my career, I found myself like super lucky, and to actually reach the top of the management of a bank. So I was in the management board of an SME house bank in Nicaragua, and with like-minded co-leaders. And I thought, wow, now I can really promote change. But I quickly came to realize that who's actually wielding power are the board members, and especially the shareholders. And so that's why I really wanted to move on to the investor side. Now, being on that side, there are, of course, a lot of advantages. I feel like it's really a key position to promote change, to have those conversations. But you still have to have those conversations, because, I mean, unfortunately, or perhaps fortunately, it's not up just to one person to decide, but you still have those committees. And that's why I'm also a huge champion of gender diversity, or broader diversity and inclusion in these decision-making committees, so in investment committees. Because if you just have this typical token person arguing for broader diversity, or arguing for a gender lens or a racial equity lens in investing, you're not really moving the needle. You need a critical mass. And I think it's also important not just to have representation, but also to have a culture, a corporate culture that values diversity, so that these different voices and contributions are actually valued and taken into consideration, and then also affect the decision-making process.
Absolutely, because I think going back to your point of having one, let's whatever the group they belong to, having one person also lobbying for the group that they belong to often falls by the wayside, because they've already proven in studies that it's perceived as being self-serving. So if as a Black woman, I'm petitioning for the rights of Black women within that construct, no one's really listening to me, because they're thinking, well, you're only doing this to get ahead. But as you said, achieving that critical mass is really what makes the difference, because being the only one comes with its own burdens and struggles as well. But having more people to speak on it from a rounded perspective brings a different element and a different momentum to decision making, because ultimately, if the groups that you're trying to help aren't in the room, everything you're doing is based upon assumption and presumption, but it's not based upon lived experience. And as we both know, there are enough qualified women out there. There are enough qualified Black women out there. There are enough qualified people from the LGBTQ community out there that can do this job. The point is more about, how do we get them into the room in the first place? Mm-hmm. And that is really where there has to be a mindset shift, or there has to be somebody in the room like yourself who's basically saying, well, hey guys, we need to think about including, or we need to kind of change our approach slightly as to how we are going to expand the table, as opposed to kind of saying, well, do you know what, you have to resign your position in order to fill it. No one's saying that, but let's make the table broad so that we can actually cover a broad spectrum of problems, as opposed to going, well, I'm not sure. There's no one that I know that fills that particular criteria. You don't need to know them. You can kind of find ways to find them.
Exactly. And I think there's also often this notion or fear that we're making the pie smaller, but we're actually making the pie bigger, because historically we've only looked at like 50% or less of the pie, and now we're considering other talents as well. So I think that's also a huge misperception, and something that's really important to keep in mind.
Yeah, because I think in general, it's kind of realizing that the pie can only get bigger if you can connect with a larger audience. That's fundamentally it. If your audience is only so small, then yeah, you're only ever going to be able to connect with a pie that's this big. But if you have more people who can speak to their tribes, then you're obviously broadening your spectrum. But as you said, that's a really hard concept sometimes for people to get their heads around, because it can sometimes feel, I don't remember where I read this, but they were saying, when you live in a place of privilege, sometimes equality feels like something's been taken away from you when it's not. And I think that can sometimes be the problem, to your point about the pie. People think they're losing something when actually there's so much more to gain.
Yeah.
Be it gender diversity, be it sexual orientation diversity, whatever it might be, there's always something to gain by expanding your horizon, which is kind of, if you think about the kind of premise of business, or the premise of the landscape in which a lot of companies work, they work on a global level. If expanding your horizon wasn't a good thing, then why did so many people end up in countries where they weren't born? Why do we have so many resources coming out of Africa? Why do we have so many people working to make clothes for us in Europe, in Bangladesh? All those things, it's because they expanded their horizons. Now we the whys and the wherefores and the details of how it happened, that we can leave for another day. But the point about it is that if Europe kept to Europe, the resources that we have now wouldn't exist.
Yeah.
We wouldn't be having coffees. We wouldn't be having sugar in our coffees. All those things we take for granted. And it's kind of like, well, if you just take that for an example, I'm not saying we should go back to colonial ways, by no means. I'm just saying, understanding that there's so much more opportunity to broaden our horizons means we have, going forward, the larger opportunity to have an impact.
Yeah. And
I think sometimes, that's also the, let's say, I'm sure you have opinions on Quotenfrau or Frauenquote. Like at the beginning, I think I even wrote about this, and I said, I used to be absolutely against quotas. I was like, no. You put quotas in place, you put a target on the person's back. However, what we've seen is people don't seem to want to make changes without them. How do you feel about it?
I've actually always been a fan, but it's because like not the instrument in and of itself, but it's the only way you can trigger change. So it's the only lever you have to really make sure that cultures change, that people or companies rather start looking at the pipeline, that they change, the way they look at promotions, and that they kind of even start just with, from the moment they start the recruitment process to actually focus on all of the talents, to get biases out of the way, to make sure they have equal pay and equality and career progression and all of that. So, I mean, there's so many policies and practices, that need to change to reach that target. But if you don't have the target, you're, like in my experience, you're not gonna get there. And especially in Germany, where you have this really bizarre situation that you have more guys who are called Thomas and Michael and like on boards than women. That's just so ridiculous. I think you're just not gonna change it if it's or like with this voluntary quota that's they have like target equal to 0.
Yeah, I know. I saw that and I was horrified.
Nothing is changing. So I think you have to be quite intentional about it, and you need to have a specific target to move towards.
No, definitely. And I think, I mean, I only discovered that this target, it was possible to put in a target of 0. And I was like, wow. Wow, that's even allowed in the system is shocking.
And you can get away with it, right?
Yeah.
I mean, one thing is that it's like legally allowed, but I mean, how can you publish this in your annual report and not get any scrutiny for it?
Yeah, but that companies even did it is what gets me. Like you excuse me, they're so bold-faced in not caring about it that they're like, oh, well, I'll put 0%. Who cares? I don't. Like, what's the big deal? And that's what I find crazy, that they actually just don't care. That's the part where you're just like, okay, wow, this is something very, very different. They just don't care. But in saying that, I mean, having followed all the work that you do, what I also think is amazing is, you're working on gender equality within business, but the work that you actually do with investing is also empowering women at the other end. So can you talk a little bit about that?
So when we came up with the 2X challenge framework and the target, we developed criteria of what it actually means to invest with a gender lens. And we really wanted to make sure that, we look at businesses holistically and at all the opportunities. So at the time, like one typical way to look at it was, to say, oh, could we focus on entrepreneurship? And often this boil down to microfinance, but not, asking the question, why aren't there the same opportunities in SME business? What is inhibiting businesses to grow, like, women-owned businesses to the SME stage or to the corporate stage? And so we wanted to be much more intentional and look at opportunities and representation along the entire value chain. So we developed 5 criteria looking at business ownership and entrepreneurship, of course, but also like leadership, on the board and top management. Then also employment, and especially quality employment. So looking at the position, like gaps that we see in occupational gender gaps, or also sector-specific gaps. If you look at the composition of, it could be that you have 60% female employees, but in what kind of positions are they? The quality of the employment. So really looking at all of that, policies and practices, and then products and services that benefit women. And I mean, obviously, we're not talking about, lipstick, but stuff like, again, it could be financial products and services that take into consideration the specific needs and also kind of the situation, the life cycle opportunities in a woman's life, related to financial security and financial independence. But it could also be something like in the healthcare space, access to reproductive healthcare, maternal healthcare, all of these topics that, especially in emerging markets, but not only, are often not, chronically underfunded and often not accessible.
Right.
But it could be a range of other things, like if we think about renewable energy or infrastructure, also, taking into consideration power dynamics and who then actually has access to energy or to different services. So all of that. And then the fifth criterion is basically looking at the first four. But when you invest in a private equity fund or in a financial institution, to look at kind of the underlying businesses that get funded.
Yeah, no, because that it's easy to kind of do, as you said, like an invest. It's easy to place an investment, but not to drill down as to find out where the money's really going. It says it's going to do this, but sometimes what it says on the tin isn't always what happens. So I like the fact that you have kind of like the 5 pillars of the strategy, really drilling down into how can we truly empower women, and what's the rub at each stage, what stops the process from tipping over into the next part. Because I think a lot of the time it's easy to look at things with a gender lens. It's easy to say, let me look at it with a Black lens in terms of processes. And, this is the same with companies saying Black Lives Matter and all this kind of stuff, or saying we have, an internal Black network, we have a women's network. But, you have to go down to understand where is the rub. Like if you're looking, in my case, if I'm looking to see, well, how are you recruiting? Well, if you're not getting Black women to apply, what's the problem? And as you said, it's not just kind of looking at a macro level. You have to go to each part of the process. I like your phrase, the value chain. That's even better. You have to go across, you have to really go from A to B, from soup to nuts, to kind of say, well, okay, how do I get to the next stage? And if people are hitting a ceiling, why are they hitting the ceiling? But not everybody looks at it like that. And that's why I love the work that you're doing, because it's impact investing, which a lot of people claim to do, but you're really doing the due diligence on a deeper level to make sure there are tangible effects, tangible impact, not just we're going to do this at large, but then, hey, we're going to invest this much, but this much is fees. So actually the person at the end only gets this much of the investment.
Yeah, and it's it's quite a lot of work, and also an investment of time and capacity and all of that. And I think that kind of brings us back to the business case, that it's often in a private sector context, it's important to show why this also is also the smart thing to do, just to kind of argue, in favor of these, and like time being invested and all of that, and to say this is not a distraction, it's actually also good for business, while still recognizing that this is also a fundamental rights issue.
Right, because I think the other point to recognize is that the work you're doing, the work I'm doing, is not easy stuff. It's not easy, and it's not quick, and it's not going to be a quick solution. The amount of work you need to put into it to get a good output is a lot. It's not going to, and I think, as you said, companies have to really understand that, but they have to understand it from a time and a financial perspective, that it's not a place where you want to cut corners, because cutting corners is the reason that we have got to the place where we've got to, in not really solving these fundamental rights issues, in still having a huge problem with gender inequality, having a huge problem with racial injustice, in the public and the private sector, or just generally. And it's not going to be a case of, hey, well, by the end of the year, I can say, I've done it, job done, here's a tick and I'm finished. It is a continuous commitment. Because as soon as you get to the end of the cycle, you go back to the beginning again to see, well, how much have I improved by? And if it's still not looking like an acceptable number, okay, so what has been missed in this process? What have we missed? What did we miss last time to be able to improve it on it again this time?
Yeah, and in a sense, this also makes business sense, because that's the way business at innovation, at products, at everything else. So you should just look at this like at other priority business issues, and really make sure you have all the systems in place to monitor progress and to become better every day.
Right. And I think that has to be, and I think that's the combination. It's like the goal should be twofold. Obviously, righting all the wrongs, all the injustices, but also understanding that this contributes to progress, but also success, because not just consumers, but employees, everybody is becoming more conscious. That's not to say everybody wants change, but we'll become more conscious as to the situation and how we're living and how the world looks and where the inequalities are. And I think at this point, it's a very special moment in time that we have to really push forth with that. But as you said, coming with concrete facts, figures to say how exactly this can help. And it's not linear. The growth will be exponential because investing in women, investing in Black women can only but pay off, right?
Exactly. And that's also, so when I talk about the business case, I'm not only talking about, kind of return on investment and all of that. Of course, that's also, there are also very compelling statistics and studies on that. But I also mean these ripple effects. So really the benefits, not only for the individual woman and the individual company, but also for local communities more broadly, for society, for the macroeconomy. So there are all of these studies that show how a whole economy and a country and a society advances, and all these very tangible ripple effects. And so I think that this is really the smartest way of investing, and it definitely it pays back so many times.
Yeah, exactly. It's like a multi-layered reward system, because it's not just about the company. It's about the company. It's about the individual. It's about society. But it's also about the future. We can't, don't get me wrong, we can't just decide that we're going to invest all of our money in climate change without looking at the social injustices, without looking at, gender inequality. We can't do any of, climate change is one big issue, but we have to be looking at all issues and how they have an impact. And, at the end of the day, we have to make sure that the future we're working towards is also worth living for everybody. It's not just about, as you said, it's not just about making money, because money will always be made, but it's like, how are you having an impact on society? How are you having an impact on your employees? Because ultimately no company runs without them.
And if you look at these, issues like massive issues like climate change, and you look at the factors or the drivers of climate change, it's actually inequality. So right. Just looking at what is really driving the problem also kind of leads you to the solution. And it's often unexpected if you're kind of looking at it, from just looking at climate and then thinking, oh, it has to be something environmental. But there's actually this, Project Drawdown, this massive study on the key underlying factors, and it's actually gender equality is a key lever for kind of climate action. And equally, if you look at all of these underrepresented groups and who are actually the agents of change and who are needed and whose voices have to be included to advance the most promising solution, it's often those that are currently not at the table. So it's all interconnected, and I think there are very strong arguments on many different levels.
Yeah, and I think there has to be a willingness, and I think probably in the last year that's changed. There's a willingness to learn. There's a willingness to be not from everybody, but there's I'd say there's a new willingness to learn. And I mean, you and I connected last year over LinkedIn, and we know that we never would have met on the street. Aside from COVID, we never would have met on the street if the world had carried on running the way it did. So there's absolutely that point of looking around to see more people who are your tribe, looking around to understand who has the same values as you, and aligning yourself more with people who have those same values. And I think as that happens more, the people who want to kind of turn a blind eye will be kind of forced to look, because, if you think the tribe is getting larger and we're all in so many different places and we're all talking about these issues without fear, but talking about them within the business space as well, it can't help but it's not just about talking, but the more you talk, the more people that are pushed to action, the more conversations like this that we have, it really does start to get people, G'd up and ready to change and want to actually find out, how can I take part? What can I do? How can I be a part of the solution? I didn't think about this, one of your points was, it's not always about looking at climate change and thinking about the environment. It's looking at a bigger part. And sometimes the part you have to play might not be obvious until you meet somebody else who says, hey, well, this is a really good idea. And I think this is what one of the beautiful things that's come out of 2020 is that not everybody, but a lot of people are speaking more, myself included, speaking more to their purpose and about their purpose and living that change, as opposed to speaking about it in a really small forum and that's it. Speaking about it, but also doing something about it. And I think that's the other point, loads of companies haven't really been forced to change. There's been no real, not just a slap on the hand, but no real punishment, no real sanctions for them not making changes. And I think that's going to be the real trigger into them really making changes. There has to be a tangible punishment, not just I can put 0% in and it's fine and no one cares. But actually, like, okay, so if you do that, we don't find you to be a good trading partner, or we're not going to invest in you if you don't kind of stick to these metrics or whatever it might be.
Yeah, because I mean, and that, looking again at the business case statistic, you're actually destroying value, because we know that companies that have gender diversity or diversity more broadly also tend to perform better financially. So you're actually burning cash for shareholders by being, that privilege. And so it's, I think that's also another lever that you have to really argue it, in kind of the mainstream business sense.
Mm-hmm.
But of course, there are also a lot of other factors, like, you're not attracting the best talent. Consumers are not going to develop that kind of brand loyalty if they know that you're just so old school.
Right. No, it's true, because at the end of the day, there has to be like a sense of agility, and there has to be a sense of understanding. Like, companies who succeed, not only do they have their finger on the pulse, but they can also foresee the trends. They can also see what's coming. And I think for the longest time, companies have kind of shied away from the fact that what's coming in terms of this need to truly diversify their leadership and management, they've kind of avoided it for the longest time. And I think 2020 has been the real push to kind of get this onto the main agenda. Now, like, talking from a from a Black Lives Matter perspective, it's, people are talking about it, and obviously it's come back in the news, but it's that thing about everybody still has to be very consistent. We still have to be consistent with our messaging, gender equality with a Black lens, investment with a gender lens, whatever it's we're doing, we have to be consistent and still keep pushing, even when people don't feel like it's a trend. Because I think, that's the key at the moment. I think sometimes people can lose power, lose steam. And I love the fact that you've dedicated your career to doing everything with a gender lens. I think it's awesome.
Yeah, and one thing I'd like to add is that, when we say gender lens, like, a lot of people think kind of about counting women or looking at women, but a gender lens is, if you really take it seriously, it's actually looking at underlying power dynamics and systemic inequalities. So by adopting a gender lens, you actually also see, it's also a racial equity lens. It's also like really having that intersectional lens and looking at the complexity of the issue, not just at looking at women, but really looking at these power dynamics in the system.
No, absolutely. And I think that's a really good point to have highlighted, because it never really is about numbers. Obviously, numbers play a part. But the reality is that if I am, let's just say, the only Black woman in management in a huge company, I don't know what a huge company would be, let's say like of 10,000 employees, if I'm the only Black woman in 10,000 employees, adding another Black woman who may just be in the building but doesn't do what I do, doesn't change the culture for me, it doesn't move the needle. So it's not always about numbers. And I think this is how people get it wrong, as to in thinking that assessing impact means increasing numbers, that assessing impact means you will all of a sudden have more of it might be simply looking at your attrition. You might be getting women in the door, you might be getting Black women in the door, but how long are they staying? And when they're leaving, why are they leaving? There's so much about understanding or using a particular lens that isn't numbers. It's psychology, it's sociology, it's anthropology. It's definitely like all different parts of science, but it's not just like chemistry, biology. It's looking at it, as you said, more than that. And I think it's not it's not binary either. There's no yes, no answer. There's no yes, no solution. Each solution is based upon each company, where they're starting from, and really what their goals are.
Yeah.
So my question is, because you've left this part out, you have not talked about XOCO.
Yeah, sorry. So I can't believe how time is flying. I thought, oh my God, this is such a long session. How are we going to fill it? And now we haven't.
I looked at Sam, I was like, okay, we only have 5 minutes left. You've said nothing. We have to get this in. It's really important.
Okay, so let me perhaps start just very briefly, where is this coming from? So for me, to be honest, the COVID crisis has been really difficult kind of personally and emotionally, because as I think, well, and probably many of the listeners, before joining DG and moving to Cologne, I lived and worked for many years in Latin America and different countries, and also in Africa. So I still have a very strong network there. And prior to the pandemic, I was also frequently traveling to the region, and most of my business relationships are there. And so when the pandemic hit and I wasn't able to travel anymore, I got a lot of calls from my network, from old friends, colleagues, the private sector, but also the NGO sector, telling me about how horrible the situation is, how the pandemic is threatening equality more broadly, but especially gender equality like never before, and really rolling back, decades of development progress. And for me, it has been particularly shocking to see how the pandemic affects adolescent girls, because when parents lose their income, like their jobs, then their income, and then families are kind of passing periods of hunger and financially, the responsibility to do something about it often falls on the shoulders of adolescent girls. And we're seeing across the region that many adolescent girls are out of school and being pushed into sexual exploitation or experiencing other forms of gender-based violence. And so I founded XOCO in the summer in collaboration with these local grassroots organizations, so like very inspiring women's rights organization working with girls, and kind of as a agile startup, because I was looking at different options, and I realized there are ways, of course, I could have done something like the 2X challenge, just connecting the dots. But often when you want to be super fast, super low cost, and also very agile and innovative, it's usually easier in a startup environment. And then you just connect the dots and leverage your networks to bring it all together, but to have a different platform. And that's why I launched XOCO. It's a nonprofit social venture, so registered as a charity in Germany, to make sure that we can accept donations and to really focus on our mission. And we're developing basically an ed tech model, so a digital education model, to empower that particular target group to leapfrog from basic education and from the current situation, however difficult it may be, to digital jobs of the future. And that in a nutshell, there are a lot of complexities around it, but I think in essence, that's the model.
No, but that right there is empowerment, and it is giving these adolescent girls the opportunity that they potentially may not have had before, due to not having access financially, due to not having support from their parents for one reason or another, if their parents have to work a lot, all those things. And that's what that's what it's fundamentally about. It's about being given or having the opportunity to succeed. And that's why I think it's so amazing, because the opportunities to succeed isn't always easy to come by, because as we've already said, sometimes it really is about being in the right network, in the right room, at the right time. But for those who don't have that opportunity, I love the fact that you're giving them that opportunity, and I think that's fantastic. So I am going to say, as a last message, this is where the lovely people can find XOCO on every Insta, LinkedIn, Twitter. I'm going to give everybody a second to kind of take that in. This is where they can also find you. I think I've got them all right. I think this is where they can find you. And, it's just been great having you here talking about everything really on a broader level, and giving us all some insight into how, you work practically looking through the gender lens, how you're empowering other women, and you know, how you're just doing a great job. So thank you so much. Just thank you. It's been amazing.
Thank you so much for the invitation.
No, my pleasure. And to our listeners, thank you very much for joining.